for joining us for this week's edition of Washington Talk. I'm Connie Kim. North Korea had threatened to go a new way and test its strategic weapon, but remained silent into the new year. The U.S., however, continues to urge North Korea to come out to talks, saying negotiations is the only way out of economic isolation. Today, we discuss what's behind North Korea's silence.
이제 세상은 곧 멀지 않아 조선민주주의 인민공화국이 보유하게 될 새로운 전략무기를 목격하게 될 것이라고.
North Korea must understand that its only path out of economic isolation is for it to engage in meaningful, good faith negotiations toward complete denuclearization.
In the studio with me today is Ms. Patricia Kim, Senior Policy Analyst with the China Program at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Ms. Kim was a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Also joining me is Bruce Klingner, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Klingner was CIA's Deputy Division Chief for Korea. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Welcome to the program. Now, I want to start with North Korea's very silent period right now. So they said they're going to pursue a new path, but we haven't seen any new message or provocation. So what exactly is North Korea preparing for right now?
Well, I think the new path is going to look very much like the old path. North Korea has always alternated threats and provocations and attacks with charm offensives. So we had about a year and a half of a charm offensive and then about a half year of we will do something dire, though unspecified, if you don't capitulate to our demands by the end of the year. And now we're waiting for the other shoe to drop. So I think they'll do a provocation. We just don't know when or which provocation they'll choose.
Ms. Kim, how are you reading this period of silence from North Korea?
Well, as Bruce said, I think ever since North Korea announced that it will seek a new way if it doesn't reach a deal by the end of 2019, everyone's been waiting for some sort of dramatic provocation or dramatic speech on January 1st. What we did see was a policy speech by Kim Jong-un saying, specifically that telling the North Korean people that they should hunker down, they should expect to weather through sanctions for a long time in the name of self-reliance and not trading away their security. Now, what is North Korea doing? I think at this moment it's taking a wait-and-see approach. It may test an ICBM or nuclear weapon at some point, but I think it's looking around its strategic environment, seeing what's going on in Washington, in Beijing, and looking for that opportune moment.
So how long is this wait-and-see approach going to continue for?
It's hard to predict these things, and as I said, there's a lot going on in Washington with impeachment and a crisis in the Middle East and so on. Beijing also is very much preoccupied with the coronavirus outbreak, with protests in Hong Kong all last year, and so I think North Korea is waiting to see what the best time is. So it's hard to say exactly when we can expect them to act.
So in North Korea, we have a new foreign minister in place. When do you think that North Korea is going to maintain this period of silence?
Well, we don't know, but it's a pretty safe bet they're going to do a provocation at some point. They did 26 missile launches last year. All of them are violations of the UN resolutions, and that's the most violations in a year ever by North Korea. Also, North Korea has historically tested or fired fewer missiles in the winter. Liquid-fueled rockets are a bit delicate, so cold weather can actually affect them, if you think back to the Challenger disaster of the American space shuttle program. So it could be because of the weather, or it could be that Russia and China are working on North Korea's behalf at the UN Security Council, trying to get sanctions reduction. So perhaps Pyongyang is waiting to see if that initiative gains traction, and then if it doesn't or when it doesn't, then they may decide to do a provocation. And they can either incrementally move up the escalation ladder, medium range, intermediate range missiles before they go crossing Trump's red line, or they could jump right to an ICBM or a nuke test.
In terms of internal messaging, they seem to be emphasizing self-reliance a lot. And we've recently seen Kim Kyung-hee, the chairman's aunt, in the public eye in the first time in 6 years. So does this have some kind of internal messaging or external messaging? How should we read into this?
There's a lot of attention paid to personnel switches and, people disappearing and reappearing in North Korea. Honestly, it's hard to predict what these mean to the outside. It could also be the case that North Korea is using this to signal things domestically. So I don't know how much we should read into it. I mean, at the end of the day, what matters is North Korea's policy. And so that's what we need to watch for.
So in this period of silence, do you think that the U.S. should wait until North Korea makes some kind of move in terms of dialogue or provocation?
Well, the U.S. has been trying to have dialogue with North Korea, not only under Mr. Begin's time, but all his predecessors would remark that at times when the U.S. was often criticized for refusing to talk with North Korea or setting high preconditions, all of those envoys who had the job before Mr. Begin were saying, I'm trying to talk to North Korea. They're the ones who refuse our phone calls or refuse meetings. So, Mr. Begin and others have said we want to have talks, we want to have diplomacy, we want to have negotiations. It's North Korea who said they rejected working level talks with Mr. Begin after a meeting in Stockholm last year. And then in December, they rejected even the idea of a summit with Mr. Trump. So, we're waiting by the phone. We're knocking on the door and they keep refusing to answer.
Do you agree with Mr. Klingner that the U.S. is going to continue to call on North Korea to come out to talks?
Yes, I think that is the U.S. policy, that we're ready to engage, especially at the working level. There is a real eagerness, I think, in the State Department to try to sit down with their North Korean counterparts and to figure out a way forward. You really can't do much if you're not talking. And so, yes, I agree with Bruce that our policy hasn't changed. We're ready to engage. I think there's this sense sometimes in North Korea that it's better to do a test or do some kind of provocation to get the world's attention in order to build leverage at the table. But what I would say is that is actually counterproductive because it reduces the political space in Washington, in Seoul, and elsewhere to really engage and find a deal with North Korea. So I would say coming to the table without doing a provocation would be the best way forward.
So at a time of deadlock, do you think that North Korea's traditional ally, China, should be stepping up in terms of brokering the talks between the two sides?
So I think China has a significant role to play. China is North Korea's treaty ally. It's served as North Korea's economic lifeline for all of these years. So absolutely, and it shares a border with North Korea. So absolutely, China has a role to play. I think China has been relatively not as active in this space because, as I said, there's a lot going on domestically. Xi Jinping has been bogged down with protests in Hong Kong, now this virus. China has been locked in a trade war with the United States as well. So there's a lot on their plate. And so I can see why they're comfortable leaving North Korea on the back burner. Having said that, I think China certainly has a bigger role to play in enforcing sanctions. It has channels with North Korea that it can use to message to bring the North Koreans to the table. So I think Beijing should definitely be playing a greater role.
So there are some concerns that China wants to maintain the status quo on North Korea, but not to do more in terms of bringing denuclearization. And we've seen China and Russia propose a resolution at the UN trying to ease sanctions. How do you assess China's, actions in terms of denuclearization efforts?
It's pretty consistent with what Beijing has done over the years. And they act like North Korea's lawyer in the UN Security Council. And they've, turned a blind eye to a lot of sanctions violations that are occurring through Chinese entities or on Chinese soil. So, true to form, they in Moscow right now are saying, well, we're not making any progress on negotiations, so once again, the U.S. and others should offer concessions. The sanctions are all a reaction to North Korean behavior, and until that behavior changes, then the sanctions should remain in place, in my view.
I want to take a look at a State Department's official's comments saying that the U.S. administration is going to continue to pursue a steady, slow, and patient diplomacy on North Korea. So do you think that this kind of stance right now is a change from the beginning of the administration?
No, I mean, I don't know if that's a change. As we discussed, I think there is a desire to do working level talks. Perhaps, earlier in the administration, there was a lot of excitement about what leader to leader level summits might unlock. I think we learned from the last two summits between President Trump and Kim Jong-un that, if you don't really have the groundwork before these summits, then it's hard to come out with a deal. And so, I think that statement reflects the fact, again, that our U.S. government, the State Department, is very eager to sit down at the working level, figure out how can we figure out a roadmap so that we both get to the end that we want. So in that sense, I don't think there's a dramatic policy change.
Do you agree with this?
Very much, but also there's a lot of confusion as to what the Trump policy is. I mean, over the years, we've had some officials saying it has to be done, denuclearization has to be done within a year. Others, including the president, have said, we don't care how long it takes. And there at times seem to be a Trump administration policy and a President Trump policy. He's made announcements which caught bureaucrats and senior officials by surprise. For example, when he unilaterally canceled a number of allied military exercises. And the president has unilaterally undermined all three pillars of the maximum pressure and engagement policy. So I think there is some confusion, but right now the policy is, we're not doing all of the military exercises. We're not enforcing all of our laws. So we are being patient, but I think right now, basically, it's a weaker policy than under President Obama.
Well, at the end of the day, the U.S.'s administration's goals remains the same, denuclearization of North Korea. I also want to take a look at North Korea's negotiation stance. They said they're not interested in engaging in the same type of negotiations with the U.S. anymore. So what kind of negotiations does North Korea want here?
Basically, they want a win-win outcome where they win twice. They're looking for, in essence, a capitulation by the U.S. They said we have to take steps to prove we don't have a hostile policy, and their definition of that changes, but it's usually a pretty long laundry list of items, everything from, removal of all UN and U.S. sanctions, cancellation of all military exercises, reduction or removal of U.S. forces, sort of the list goes on and on. So, they have a Rolodex of demands that one of them tends to be the top the top demand at the time, but the overall list is quite long.
Mm-hmm. Then do you think the U.S. is going to accept North Korea's demand to withdraw their hostile policies against North Korea? Well, their claim of hostile policies on the U.S.
Sure. So, I think, all of the demands that Bruce listed out, a lot of times you can sort of boil it down to the fact that North Korea wants economic sanctions relief first, and it wants some sort of tacit recognition as a nuclear power. And on those issues, the United States is not going to budge. I think we've made it clear that sanctions relief cannot come before North Korea comes to the table. It needs to be something that we map out together at the table. So in that sense, I don't think the United States has any interest in accepting that sort of proposition by North Korea.
Mm-hmm. So this year we are looking ahead of a presidential election. Are you concerned that President Trump might settle for a not good enough deal or another summit with North Korea to contain its provocations?
I'm always concerned that any U.S. president is going to have a bad or a small or a flawed agreement. We've had 8 failed agreements with North Korea in the past. None of them were as extensive and carefully crafted as, say, the arms control treaty we had with the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. The election, I don't think, is going to revolve around a North Korea deal, but North Korea may feel that it does. So they've commented on the U.S. presidential election several times. I don't remember them doing that in the past. So I think they feel they have leverage, even though it really isn't going to have an impact on the U.S. election.
Mm-hmm. How do you think North Korea is going to use the presidential elections to their advantage? I'm sure they're looking at the domestic politics in Washington, and I'm sure that is having some kind of calculations behind their strategies, right?
Well, North Korea may be looking at the presidential election period as a period where they feel, President Trump needs to show some sort of progress, so he may be eager to rush to a deal. Honestly, I'm not really sure if that's the case. And if anything, I think the presidential election period is difficult for North Korea because it shifts the attention away from them towards other issues, towards domestic issues. So I'm not really sure if trying to manipulate the elections to squeeze more out of this situation is necessarily going to work in their favor.
Mm-hmm. Before we go, I want to ask both of you, at this current deadlock, then what should the U.S. do in terms of making a breakthrough or in terms of making an opening on talks with North Korea? What should the U.S. do?
Well, I don't know how much the U.S. has left to do in the sense that we continually leave our door open. We say we want to engage at the working level, and I think that's the right thing to do. And you need to have a willing partner on the other side.
In my view, has often been is that when North Korea is refusing to move forward or comply, and we have a stalemate, people tend to say, well, what more can the U.S. offer? What other concession can we make? What other law can we violate? And that's not the right policy. It's like a bank robber and a policeman is saying, well, the bank robber is still misbehaving. What more could the policeman do to make the robber feel less threatened? And that's not the right policy.
All right, we'll leave it here for now and move on to our next segment.
My mission would be to hold North Korea responsible to recover and discover their assets around the world.
A German court has ruled that the hostel located on the grounds of the North Korean embassy in Berlin must close down. The court says its operations breach sanctions aimed at stopping the flow of hard currency to Pyongyang. What impact will this have on North Korea's other foreign assets abroad? So, Ms. Kim, how did you assess this German court's ruling on the shutdown of City Hostel?
I think it was a small but important step on starting to enforce sanctions that have been passed at the UN. From what I understand, the North Korean embassy was making about $50,000 a month on leasing out its property. So that in the grand scheme of things, that's not that much money. However, I think this ruling and this effort to shut down this hostel is a good step forward in showing the world that we have the will to enforce sanctions that have been passed at the UN.
How did you read this German court's
I
ruling?
agree. It's not a make or break issue for the regime, but certainly when any violation comes to public attention, if you don't act on it, then you're really sending a signal of compliance or not obeying the law and really just giving North Korea a benefit. So particularly once any entity is exposed, you really have to go after them just to enforce the law.
Mm-hmm. Is it normal for an embassy to be leasing out property for entities for commercial purposes?
I don't know, but I wouldn't think so. It seems to be inconsistent with the purpose of an embassy for diplomacy. But with North Korea, there are sanctions which preclude that. So just as North Korea perhaps is the only nation in the world precluded from space launch vehicles or ballistic missile launches, in this case, North Korea may be unique in having laws against that, but it really is inconsistent with what the UN resolutions require.
Mm-hmm. And we've seen the UN panel of experts pointing out other cases, other similar cases where North Korean embassies are leasing out property for other commercial purposes. So what kind of a message do you think this ruling will send to those countries?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the ruling sends the message, again, that you need to enforce these sanctions, but it also shows, from what I understand, it took a year or more to actually get to be able to go to court and shut down this operation. And so it shows that there needs to be a will as well. And so it's unclear, what the situation is exactly in all of these other countries where North Korea is doing similar operations, but it shows that it takes effort. You need to go through the rule of law in that country as well. And so there are steps that need to be taken to actually enforce these sanctions.
Do you agree with Ms. Patricia saying that this is a case where international sanctions were effectively enforced?
I think so. It took a long time. And a lot of times when the U.S. officials are going around having quiet meetings with host governments, it's not always a kick in the door and say, you're not, enforcing the law. Sometimes it's, we have information you don't, that there are North Korean entities violating your laws or UN resolutions, or just bringing it to their attention or letting them know kind of the specifics of these pretty lengthy and detailed UN resolutions. So, in many cases, things have been done quietly where host governments will shut down some kind of North Korean money-making operation, and we don't even hear about it, in the media or through formal sanctions enforcement.
Mm-hmm. And in the bigger picture, we've seen parents of Otto Warmbier saying that they're going to seize, they're doing all they can to seize North Korea's foreign assets abroad. But what is the challenge behind this?
Well, these criminal activities are, meant to be concealed. So, just as the police have to constantly kind of evolve and change in reaction to a criminal organization or North Korea's evolving tactics, and they're becoming more sophisticated in evading resolutions, the authorities have to, identify how North Korea changes its tactics when it shifts from one entity to another. So the police or authorities have to kind of constantly change their own tactics in response to North Korea's changing tactics.
Mm-hmm. What do you think is the challenge behind this?
Well, I mean, I agree with everything Bruce said, and also it's hard to track down everything, right? It becomes a capacity problem as well. And if you want to hide something, there are a lot of things you can do to hide it. There may be other nationals who are tied to this, who are, aiding or profiting for individual reasons. And so there, it's a capacity problem.
So do you think that this case will serve as a precedent where we're going to be seeing more North Korean assets being shut in the future?
Yeah, I certainly hope so. Just as the other actions to enforce sanctions in the past hopefully set a precedent or alerted not only North Korea that we will continue to go after their illicit activities, but also a signal to governments or business organizations that there is a cost if you try to help North Korea evade sanctions or evade laws. So, some entities may not be aware that what they were doing with North Korea was a violation, but when it's been brought to their attention, then if they don't comply, then certainly they have to pay a penalty.
Mm-hmm. Then do you think that this could be seen as an example where President Trump's maximum pressure campaign is effectively being implemented?
Well, maximum pressure has never been maximum. There's many, many things the U.S. is holding back on. And the president himself said last year there are 300 North Korean entities he's not sanctioning. That's 300 entities violating U.S. law in the U.S. financial system on U.S. soil, and we've chosen to not enforce our laws. And Congress sent a list of 12 Chinese banks, including the 4 largest in the world, which they feel are committing money laundering crimes in the U.S., and the White House has taken action against none of them. And the list goes on.
But President Trump does say that they've never lifted any sanctions.
Well, we have not formally rescinded executive orders or reversed U.S. legislation, but they have not fully implemented U.S. law. All those examples I just cited. President Trump reversed Treasury Department's actions against 2 Chinese shipping companies that were violating UN sanctions. So they've taken actions against U.S. law enforcement measures, and they've also not fully implemented them.
All right, we'll leave it here for now and move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment to look at an interesting North Korea photo of the week. Today we see North Korea's Korean Central Television showing preventative measures for the coronavirus. North Korea is on high alert to contain the spread of the virus, urging people wash their hands after coughing or sneezing and before eating, especially because there are concerns that their medical infrastructure are not good enough to prevent the spread of the viruses. What do you make of this photo?
Well, they're certainly doing not only kind of safe sanitary practices, but they've closed their border with China. So very drastic measures in response to right now the very real worldwide concern about this new virus as everyone's trying to figure out how to prevent its spread. So perhaps drastic steps in closing a border, but they are trying to prevent the virus from getting into North Korea.
Ms. Kim?
I mean, I think this photo shows that, we're all humans, we're all concerned about the coronavirus, we're all concerned about new diseases, and so it shows a commonality and an interest in health. They have taken drastic measures to try to shut down their border, but I understand that Russia has done that as well. And so, I think it just shows that that there are some commonalities there.
All right, thank you, Ms. Kim. Thank you, Mr. Klingner. Thank you.
Thank you.
That does it for today's Washington Talk, and from all of us here at Voice of America. Thank you for watching. This has been Connie Kim.